Have you ever navigated the complex world of mental health care only to sort of hit a wall with your insurance company?
Yeah, it's a common story, unfortunately.
Maybe you needed ongoing support, for something chronic, but were told it wasn't medically necessary past a few sessions, or that only short-term fixes were on the table.
It's incredibly frustrating, and it really highlights this disconnect between what patients often need and what insurance has historically covered.
Right, this idea that psychotherapy, especially maybe longer term therapy, is some kind of, I don't know, unnecessary indulgence.
Exactly that perception.
Well, that perception is precisely what we're digging into today. This deep dive explores the whole tangle: mental health care, insurance, the law, and some, frankly, eye-opening research. Stuff that challenges common assumptions about effective treatment.
Our mission really is to unpack why certain effective therapies get undervalued and what that means for you if you're seeking lasting help.
And we're mainly drawing from a really insightful article in Psychoanalytic Inquiry by Susan Lazar MD, plus some key legal findings and a lot of research data. So let's start with this disconnect. Because on paper, the legal side looks pretty solid, doesn't it?
It does. You've got major laws like the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, MHPAEA, back in 2008.
And the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, in 2010.
Right. Both mandating parity between mental and physical health care. Psychotherapy is even listed as an essential health benefit.
So why the problem? Why has support, especially for things like dynamic psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, been so, well, poor historically?
A big part is definitely the historical stigma around mental illness. That really fueled the misconception you mentioned, therapy as a luxury, not a necessity.
A luxury item. And
Yeah.
how did that idea get cemented? You hear terms like price elasticity or moral hazard thrown around.
Well, from the perspective of some insurers and policymakers, price elasticity suggests that if therapy is cheap or easy to access, people will just overuse it, which leads to the moral hazard concern, this idea of unnecessary use.
Oh.
And that thinking, historically, justified things like higher copays or even just excluding coverage to discourage people from seeking care.
Okay, but then MHPAEA made those higher copays illegal. So what did insurers do next to limit reimbursement?
They shifted to more indirect tactics, things like medical reviews.
Ah, the reviews.
Yeah, triggered maybe if you went over some arbitrary session cap, like, say, 20 visits.
Mhm.
And these reviews often decided that more treatment just wasn't medically necessary,
Based on what, though?
based on the insurance company's own proprietary guidelines, which crucially often weren't in line with established professional standards of care.
And the real-world impact of skimping on this support, especially for people who are really struggling.
Well, the higher costs push people away,
Ew.
especially poorer patients who might just forego treatment altogether.
Which sounds bad enough, but there's more, isn't there?
There is. And here's the kicker. Inadequate outpatient care for seriously ill patients actually drives up overall costs. Through increased emergency room visits, more hospitalizations, these costs often blow past any savings from limiting the outpatient therapy. Plus, you see increased illness, increased disability.
So it's the classic penny-wise, pound-foolish scenario. Cutting therapy costs ends up costing the whole system way more.
Precisely. And patients with mental illness tend to have higher general medical costs, to more GP visits, higher outpatient charges elsewhere, longer hospital stays for other things. It's a completely false economy.
It really makes you think about the true cost. Okay, let's pivot to the science then, because you still hear this idea that psychotherapy, particularly longer forms, is an unneeded expense. Does the research actually back that up?
No, not at all. Decades of research challenge that. Take the Rand Health experiment. Big study. Found that even when therapy was completely free, only about 4% of the insured group used it.
Only 4%.
And they averaged just 11 sessions. It hardly points to massive overuse, does it?
Not really.
Plus, there's tons of research showing psychodynamic therapies are efficacious, effective, and cost-effective. Evidence that insurers often, well, overlook.
Interesting. How does psychotherapy stack up against, say, medication or other therapies?
Well, research shows therapy often boosts the effect of meds, the reverse. Less clear. Also, 75% of patients actually prefer therapy to meds alone. Dropout rates are lower for therapy. And obviously, no medication side effects.
Okay, preference, fewer dropouts, no side effects. Any data on long-term outcomes?
Yes, quite striking data, actually. One retrospective study looked at people with first episode mild to moderate major depression.
Okay.
Those treated with brief dynamic psychotherapy alone. 72% were still in remission 5 years later, with no more treatment.
72%. Compared to what?
compared to 47% for those treated only with antidepressant medication over the same period.
Wow, 72% versus 47%. That's a huge difference long term, just from brief dynamic therapy. Any idea why such a sustained difference?
It likely speaks to addressing underlying patterns, not just symptoms. But speaking of comparisons, we always hear about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, often called the gold standard, the most evidence-based. How does that claim hold up under scrutiny?
Yeah, you hear that constantly.
It is common, mostly because there are many randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, but that gold standard label, it's being questioned more and more.
Oh, so
Well, for instance, one big meta-analysis of 23 trials found psychodynamic therapy was actually equivalent to CBT for the main target symptom.
equivalent. Oh.
And when you look closely at the CBT research itself, you find issues. Frequent publication bias, positive results get published more. Effect sizes are often pretty small. Many trials have weak empirical tests. There's the issue of researcher allegiance researchers favoring their own preferred therapy. And the efficacy itself is limited. Response or remission rates for depression and anxiety often hover around 50% or even less. And get this, one review found only 7% of CBT RCTs for anxiety and depression were actually high quality.
Only 7%. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement for a gold standard.
It certainly complicates the picture.
And I guess the kind of people in these studies matters too. Are they typical patients?
That's a huge point. These brief, manualized CBT trials, they usually recruit people with just one specific diagnosis.
Which isn't typical.
Not at all. Most people seeking help have more complex issues, often multiple conditions. Comorbidity is common.
Right?
And even when these brief treatments show statistically significant improvement, it often means pretty short-lived benefits. About half the patients are looking for more treatment within 6 to 12 months. Many just don't fully recover without more therapy.
Okay, so if short-term isn't always enough, especially for complex cases, that leads us to cost-effectiveness. And you mentioned earlier, that's not just about being cheap, is it?
Exactly. It's a crucial distinction. Cost-effectiveness isn't about the lowest price tag. It's about the financial cost relative to the positive outcomes you get, the impact per dollar spent.
So what society decides is worth paying for real, lasting results.
Precisely. Not just the cheapest option up front.
Understood. So who really needs this more extended or intensive therapy, and why is treating them properly so important from that societal cost view?
Generally, it's patients with chronic, complex, or recurrent conditions. Think personality disorders, severe long-term depression or anxiety, maybe multiple chronic issues happening together.
Okay.
These groups, if you don't treat them adequately, they become incredibly costly to society healthcare use, disability, lost productivity. And it's important to know, both the duration of therapy, how long it lasts, and the frequency, how often you go, have independent positive effects, especially for the severely and chronically ill. More is often better and leads to the best outcomes.
And that brings us back to that cost offset idea. Investing more upfront saves money later.
Yes, exactly. Investing in extended intensive therapy for those who need it often pays off significantly down the line. You see decreased sick leave, lower medical costs for other conditions, fewer hospitalizations. The initial investment creates savings elsewhere.
Okay, now the source mentioned something really striking about personality disorders specifically. Their impact goes beyond just mental health costs.
It does, significantly. Personality disorders affect a lot of people, maybe 9 to 13% of the population, potentially 30 million Americans. These individuals often struggle with deeply ingrained maladaptive patterns.
Leading to
Things like chronic unemployment, substance abuse, suicide attempts, sometimes criminal behavior, high rates of divorce, child abuse, and yes, very heavy use of both mental and general health care.
That's a huge societal burden.
It is. But here's a really arresting point. The impaired interpersonal relationships, which are a hallmark of personality disorders, they represent a greater risk factor for mortality than smoking, obesity, alcoholism, or hypertension.
Wait, greater risk of dying than smoking.
That's what the research indicates. It underscores that this isn't just about feeling better. It's about fundamental health and longevity.
That is genuinely shocking. So different therapies might help symptoms, but long-term psychodynamic approaches are better for those core relationship problems.
That's where they show significant superiority, improving those maladaptive interpersonal dynamics.
And you also mentioned a sleeper effect. What's that?
Yes, the sleeper effect. It means that patients in psychodynamic therapy often don't just maintain their progress after treatment ends.
Yeah.
They actually continue to improve.
They keep getting better on their own.
Exactly. The benefits continue to unfold. This is vital for long-term recovery. And specifically with borderline personality disorder, improvement takes time, significantly longer.
Uh,
The UK's National Institute for Health and Care Excellence actually cautions against brief interventions for BPD, noting that significant improvement usually only starts after 12 months of therapy.
a full year.
Yes, psychodynamic therapy gets at the underlying intrapsychic structures, which seems necessary for broader, lasting personality change, not just symptom relief.
Okay, what about depression? You hear so much about it being a leading cause of disability worldwide.
It is. The WHO flagged it back in 2008 as the greatest cause of disability globally. And disturbingly, primary care doctors apparently miss the diagnosis about half the time.
50%. Wow. And treatment-resistant depression.
Those patients have much higher healthcare costs, more hospitalizations. Now, long-term CBT, psychoanalytic, and psychodynamic therapies might show similar initial symptom improvements in depression.
Right.
But more intensive psychoanalytic treatment seems to sustain greater improvement over the long haul. And crucially, psychodynamic approaches are detectably better at improving those interpersonal problems.
Which, as you said, are linked to the depression sticking around or coming back.
Exactly. They're strongly correlated with persistent depression and relapse. So addressing those patterns is key.
Does it work better for certain types of depressed patients?
Yes. Research suggests patients who are highly perfectionistic or those with lingering symptoms like dysfunctional social patterns tend to do better in intensive, extended psychoanalytic treatment. Psychodynamic approaches seem particularly effective with these traits.
Is there any, biological evidence for this? Brain changes?
Actually, yes. Studies have found that long-term psychodynamic psychotherapy can cause specific changes in the brain and the limbic system and prefrontal cortex that are associated with depression improvement, treatment-specific changes.
That's fascinating. Mind-body connection right there. Now, what if someone has both depression and a personality disorder? That sounds incredibly tough to treat.
It is a challenging combination. These patients are generally more treatment-resistant, the depression tends to be more persistent, and their overall functioning is more impaired.
So what's the most cost-effective approach then?
Treating both conditions thoroughly. Even if treating the personality disorder requires longer, more intensive therapy, it's vital for sustained recovery and ultimately more cost-effective than just managing depressive symptoms short-term.
So the evidence really piles up.
It does. Large studies, thousands of outpatients, consistently show long-term psychodynamic therapy and psychoanalysis lead to big improvements, symptom reduction, personality change, better overall functioning.
And that translates to real savings.
Yes. Reduced healthcare use, less sick leave, less work absenteeism, fewer hospitalizations. Psychoanalysis might cost more upfront, but studies suggest it's actually more cost-effective when you factor in health-related quality of life improvements.
Okay, the evidence seems really compelling for efficacy, cost-effectiveness, especially for complex issues. But as we started with, insurers have historically pushed back. How did this tension finally boil over into the legal system?
Well, remember those parity laws, MHPAEA and ACA? They demanded equal treatment for both quantitative limits, like number of sessions, and non-quantitative limits, the protocols and guidelines used.
Right.
But insurers often kept using those substandard, overly restrictive medical necessity guidelines we talked about. Guidelines not developed by the recognized nonprofit clinical specialty groups who actually set the standards of care.
Okay, so they weren't using the standards set by the experts in the field.
Correct, and that really set the stage for the Witt v. United Behavioral Health lawsuit.
The landmark case, tell us about that. What happened?
It was a class action suit decided in 2019 against United Behavioral Health, UBH. And Judge Joseph Sparrow's findings were pretty damning.
Such as?
He found UBH's guidelines were not primarily based on generally accepted standards of care. Their main goal was utilization management.
Meaning controlling costs.
Exactly. Keeping benefit expenses down, partly to blunt the impact of the Parity Act. The judge stated financial self-interest was a critical consideration in their decisions.
Wow. Did he find proof?
Yes. UBH's own finance department apparently had veto power over the clinical guidelines. Cost saving was paramount.
Unbelievable.
He also found UBH focused excessively on just managing acute symptoms, stabilizing crises, basically ignoring the need to treat underlying chronic conditions effectively.
Yeah.
Their idea of improvement was just symptom reduction, not preventing relapse or maintaining function long-term, which deviates hugely from accepted standards.
So what was the court's final verdict?
The court concluded UBH's guidelines were unreasonable and an abuse of discretion. UBH was found liable for wrongly denying benefits to potentially thousands of patients. A huge deal.
A major victory for patients, certainly. Did that ruling have knock-on effects, particularly in California where the case was?
Oh, absolutely. It directly led to critical legislation in California Senate Bill 855, or SB 855, signed into law in September 2020.
And this bill was connected to the Witt case.
Directly. It was drafted with help from the attorney who led the Witt case, and it's truly transformative legislation for mental health parity.
How so? What does it do?
First, it expands parity protections to cover all mental health and substance use conditions in the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual, not just a select few like before.
That's big.
Huge. It also establishes a statewide definition of medical necessity that must align with those generally accepted standards of care, specifically citing the principles from the Witt decision.
So insurers can't just make up their own restrictive definitions anymore.
Not in California. They're legally required to exclusively use medical necessity criteria developed by those nonprofit clinical specialty associations like the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry or the American Society of Addiction Medicine.
And they have to prove they're using them correctly.
Yes, they even need training from these associations and have to achieve 90% inter-rater reliability, meaning different reviewers agree on the decisions most of the time. And the law explicitly forbids limiting coverage to just short-term or acute treatment.
What about finding providers? That's often a huge barrier, the network being too small.
SB 855 addresses that too. It requires insurers to cover out-of-network care if timely in-network care isn't available according to specific standards.
So it incentivizes them to build better networks.
Exactly, by making them pay competitive rates to attract more providers. One more key thing. It bans discretionary clauses in insurance contracts, meaning courts have to review claims against insurers de novo completely fresh, without giving deference to the insurer's initial decision. This makes it much harder for insurers to get away with unreasonable denials.
This sounds like a potential game changer, not just for California, maybe.
That's the hope and the likely implication. The Witt decision and SB 855 are really paving the way for a broader national push. They provide strong legal backing for patients, therapists, advocates to demand proper support for clinically necessary extended and intensive therapies, including psychodynamic approaches.
So when you pull it all together, the research clearly shows long-term psychodynamic therapy isn't just effective, it can actually save significant costs down the line by reducing other medical expenses, improving overall function.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what's the real cost to society when we stick to prioritizing short-term fixes over comprehensive, lasting recovery? And maybe what role do we, as informed people, have in pushing for a system that truly values long-term well-being?